Hi, great to be here. This is, in fact, I think a very timely set of questions. We have a nice set from the audience, which we will address shortly after people do brief introductions. I just want to start by noting that the amount of data, as you all know, that's available for making decisions about hiring, sales, people analytics is tremendous. There are lots of wonderful examples of companies doing great good with it and lots of examples of companies getting a little bit embarrassed when something turns out that someone is using Facebook searches to ask for how you might find men who will be able to be nice sales clerks in my store. Lots of inadvertent uses, lots of contests in other fields like criminal sentencing, where it turns out that decisions are being made with computer aids based on often the wrong metric. We would like to know whether someone will commit a crime, but in fact we're predicting whether they'll be arrested again, which is not quite the same piece. And one thing I hope will come from this is a better thought about some of the frameworks for addressing ethical questions and some of the gotchas in terms of, are we really measuring the right things with the analytics? Are we predicting the thing that we're doing? Is this giving us the result we want? With that, I'm going to be quiet and turn things over to Meg to talk about her introductory remarks.
Thanks, Lyle. It's great to be here. Thought I would say some words relevant to this conference, I think. We're on an ethics panel here, and some of the questions that came from the audience was sort of asking what's ethical to do, what's the right ethical thing. One thing that I've sort of learned working on ethics in an applied setting in a corporation is that ethics isn't going to tell you what's right. Ethics kind of gives you a way of looking at different aspects of the problem. So whether to use different kinds of model, different kinds of predictive software, and how to use it requires deliberation over the risks, the benefits, things that are foreseeable that can be mitigated, things that are foreseeable that might be very harmful, the social impact. And that requires knowing exactly how some specific model will be used in context. So it's not enough to sort of speak to whether or not a model is ethical. The question is, how is this model going to be used and applied? And that will help you sort of understand what is going to be the source of possible concerns. And to kind of think through it, there are a few different ethical formalisms that help you. So there's virtue ethics, which tells you a bit about doing what's right based on personal sort of character goals, like honor and truth, this idea of being virtuous. There's consequentialism, which is sort of the ends justify the means approach to ethics, where you say, as long as the end goal turns out well, then what happens in the process doesn't really matter. There's deontological approaches, which is really focused on doing the right actions, even if the outcome isn't right, but following some moral framework or some moral guidelines is the right thing to do, and then the outcome is not so much of a concern. There's pragmatics, which I think we might also talk about later too, which has more to do about the interaction of people, things like social reform, these kinds of issues. And so when approaching decisions of whether or not to use a technology and how to use it, it's important to kind of think through these different lenses, these different perspectives. And what will tell you like what's right or wrong is ultimately going to be based on what your values are or what your company's values are. So it's actually really useful to have a set of principles or a set of values that your company aligns on and agrees to in order to calibrate risk and benefit with respect to those values and what the company is trying to do. So those are just sort of my high-level thoughts that I think might be useful based on some of the questions, and I hope that's more helpful than harmful.
Great, and we'll, as we do specific questions, I'm sure those will come up again and again. Arvind?
Thank you, Lyle. Thank you, Meg. Hi, everyone. When I accepted to be on this panel, I was very excited, and the organizers responded to me and said, you can speak about whatever you want. We have only one request, and that is be constructive. They said, we know that a lot of ethics panels can get into 40 minutes of philosophy. Try not to do that. So when we were preparing for this panel, we decided to strike a happy medium between kind of higher level philosophical questions and some of the more concrete questions. And so with that aim, I wanted to just start off by giving you maybe one kind of tool or question that I find it helpful to ask when we're considering the question of a new technology and its ethical implications. I think there are broadly two kinds of questions that people ask about new technologies. One is, I want to deploy this technology for analytics. How do I do it in an ethical way? But another question, maybe not as often asked, but I think is important to ask is it ethical to use this technology at all? And the question that I want to give you is towards answering the second kind of concern. When is it ethical to use a particular technology? And for this, I want to go back to a historical analogy, because I find it very useful to look at things that have happened a century ago or more, where a lot of similar concerns have been faced. And so the question that I will give you is to ask yourself, is this technology like the elevator or like the lie detector? And let me explain what I mean. When elevators were first introduced, especially automated elevators that didn't have an operator in them, people were terrified. They saw these as death traps. They just wouldn't go into them. And there was no consumer acceptance of this technology. And people at the time had very legitimate safety concerns. But if we think about how the technology evolved, with advancing technology, we were able to get them to be incredibly safe to the point where we don't think about that today. So that's one kind of ethical concern that people might have about technology. There's something having to do with it's being very new and untested, and it could be safety concerns, it could be fairness concerns, it could be a variety of other things. But now let's look at the lie detector, which is also pretty old, 80 to 90 years old at this point. In the first court case in which the lie detector was used, the jurors were very impressed. They said the technology has decided this is going to be the wave of the future. There was kind of huge optimism around it, but there were also concerns. Is it actually, how accurate is it? What are the ethical implications? So then if we roll the clock forward, 80, 90 years later, lie detectors still are where they were back then. The accuracy is not very good. Courts have examined the evidence and still refuse to accept them in most courts. And the majority of scientists who study the polygraph consider it to be pseudoscience. And I would say that the key distinction here is because in the case of the elevator, the concerns were things that could be addressed by technology, whereas in the case of the polygraph, the concerns had to do with fundamental faulty assumptions that are used in the design of the lie detector that the evidence hasn't really supported over the years. And that's why its accuracy hasn't improved very much at all in 80 to 90 years, and it's still only slightly better than a coin toss. So bringing this back to people analytics and big data and AI, I worry that at least some of the cases where people bring up ethical concerns are more like the lie detector than like the elevator. And what I mean is, to give you an example, when we're talking about technologies like using AI to analyze people's videos and figure out if they're going to be a good employee or not by using AI and machine learning, I worry that these are based on faulty assumptions about being able to predict somebody's job performance based on body language and other characteristics. And I think in those cases we should ask ourselves hard questions. Is this actually like a lie detector? Do we think that improving technology is going to address the fairness concerns, or is it something deeper? Is it ethical to use this technology at all? So that's the opening thought that I'll give you, and I'm sure we can get into more detail.
Yeah, I love the metaphor. I think it is often the case that things that you first think are ethical turn out, in fact, to be very pragmatic. Is it ethical to use this? Well, does it even work? Is it accurate enough? Does it measure the right thing? Am I telling you something about someone which is not relevant to their job performance? So I have an accurate prediction of the wrong thing. And that question of accuracy sort of leads to the first audience question, which is the use of psychometrics for hiring selection is a growing segment of AI space. And the question is, how much accuracy do you need, right? Given that things are on somewhere between elevators and lie detectors, how accurate does something, a psychometric thing, have to be to really want to use it?
Right, so I get this kind of question at work too when it comes to machine learning models as well. I think one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is how well a system works across different populations. And so it's not so much important to focus on exactly what the overall number is of accuracy, but actually what the differences are between different kinds of people that it's going to be applied to, so that people have relatively the same experience given the model. And so it's generally not the case that you're going to find one minimum threshold. I mean, we probably don't want to use technology that doesn't work. But no technology is perfect, and one of the critical things to keep in mind is how well is this working for the different aspects I'm looking at, for the different demographics, for the different roles. And if it's not close to parity, then you might not want to use it because there will be some section of your workforce who is getting disproportionately negative experiences from the use of that technology.
That's a great answer. Just one little thing I'll add to that is to also ask the question in a long-term sense, not just where is the accuracy today and what is the parity like today, but how has this technology improved over time? Where do we expect it to be in 10 years? Because if you're making an investment in a new way, whether it's psychometrics or something else of analytics, you're probably in it for the long term. And so what really matters is not only where things are today, but where things are going to be over the lifetime of your use of that technology.
I think from my comment on that, often one of the problems that people make is they look at overall accuracy.
Yep.
And you forget to say, is this working as well in my Southern California population? I once ran a bunch of correlations of IQ tests and performance, and I found a subpopulation doing really badly. Yeah. And it turned out they were all Philippine immigrants who were perfectly smart, but in fact did really well on really badly on English language IQ tests, which was irrelevant for the thing we were evaluating. So in fact, we perfectly measured their ability to answer English language IQ tests, but it was entirely irrelevant for the question at hand. And it's very easy when you have, I think one of the problems I see with a lot of these methods, it's often hard to interpret what's happening. So you get these complicated models, you measure the accuracy, okay, this thing is 94% accurate, but you don't see what 6% you're getting wrong, and there may be some subgroup you've done really badly on.
Yeah, and like speaking to that too, like people talk about accuracy numbers, but it's also really important to think about what the cost of a false negative is and what the cost of a false positive is. And so obviously in different kinds of situations, you're going to want to prioritize one or the other. And so looking at metrics that speak directly to those trade-offs is really important.
And there are a lot of nice visualization techniques. How does this vary across different subgroups, across regions? What would be good? Amazon famously launched their one-day delivery service based on what were the subgroups and areas that had the most consumption. And you get these beautiful maps that showed we're doing it here, 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 here. And right in the middle is one little zip code full of black people who are not getting same-day service. Amazon was entirely non-malicious.
Right.
I talked to the guys. It was done with no demographics. It was done purely on purchase history. They were not trying to do a whole donut hole and avoid giving same-day service to blacks. They were really embarrassed. They fixed it when it was pointed out. But no one had actually looked to see what's the geographic variation of where this does this. Are we affecting some subset of our customers or employees differently? And I think it's super easy with these complex algorithms to get something that takes one group and says, well, forget you. You're not important to us, when you really didn't mean to.
Yeah.
Cool. Let me move on maybe to a second question. So we're getting to the place where we can get data sources about employees at any time. We know what their email is, their Slack communications, their news, their social media. We know what they're engaged in. We know who they're calling. And we might want to use this for good things, to try and find the right assignments to give to the right person. Where is this done well? Are there gotchas we should worry about?
Do you want to speak to this first? Or?
This is a tough one.
Meg, go ahead.
Yeah, so so where is this done well? I guess I don't have background knowledge on places where it's done well, and I don't know if you do, Lyle, but I think one thing that's worth thinking about there is, again, like when we're thinking about ethical deliberation processes, what are the harms and risks of doing this without your workers' knowledge versus with your workers' knowledge, and sort of make decisions about whether to do it based on that. So for example, if using this kind of information is going to lead to a lack of worker trust, then that cost or that risk might not be worth any perceived benefit from using that technology. So it's just sort of another factor to keep in mind about whether or not to use it at all.
Yeah, one quick thing I'll add to that is my understanding of these tools right now is that they're really good at solving problems from the employer's perspective. Yeah. How do you optimize the scheduling of workers such that you're able to maintain a certain number of customer service representatives every hour, things like that. And when we set up the analytics problem that way, we often miss what matters from the employee's perspective. The externalities, so to speak, that they incur, and the burden, whether it's economic or whether it's psychological, that they incur because of a scheduling algorithm, that might ask you to report to work in an hour, which kind of ruins your ability to schedule the rest of the day or the rest of your week. So these hidden costs to employees are not factored into these tools. And at the same time, there are a lot of scheduling problems that employees want to solve. And the tools are not there to help them solve those problems because they're set up to solve employers' problems. And I think that's perhaps one way in which the framing of the tool could be shifted in order to benefit both sides of the equation better.
So one way to summarize that, when you collect employee data and use it for something, who is benefiting? Is it benefiting the company at the cost of the employee by saying, hey, Arvind, I need you here in 3 hours. Come right now, drop what you're doing? Or is it benefiting the employee by saying, as one company I talked to, we're trying to find coaching. We want to identify people within our company that will best benefit from the appropriate form of coaching. We've got an overall contract with this coaching company, but we want to match up services to employees to help them go the best in each direction.
That's great.
And I think that's a good example, and I think it sort of raises another set of questions, which is what information gets shared with whom. As one of the questions we got asked is, if you're doing employee well-being surveys, as increasingly companies are doing, and if the company might have some negative attitudes often toward people with mental health problems, is it legitimate to do a well-being survey if that then might be used in some sense to discriminate or have some sort of negative consequences against people who are having mental health problems?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. Like figuring out whether or not that's good or bad is based on who's being affected by it, who's going to see the data, what they're going to do with it. There's been sort of a related problem I go to a lot of academic conferences, and a lot of them are starting to put in place like sexual harassment policies, and they say report it to the organizers. And then, I would be an organizer and be like, what am I going to do with that information? Like, so, it might be well-intentioned to do this kind of thing, but it's really important to make sure that the entire chain involved is on the same page about what to do with this information and how it's going to be used.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit from kind of the other hat that I wear, which is studying privacy. And one of the things that's common when you're looking at data privacy is to break down the acceptable uses of data into several categories. For some types of data, it might be perfectly okay to use it on an individual level with the employee or whoever it is being identified, provided you're sufficiently transparent about how you're using the data. Employees have a right to question that process, et cetera, et cetera. In some cases, it might be okay to use it on an individual level, but maybe in an anonymized form. In other cases, it might not be ethically okay to use it at an individual level, even if in an anonymized form, but it might be okay to use it at an aggregate level to report something for a group of employees, maybe on a per manager level, something like that. And in yet other cases, the data might be too sensitive to use even in an aggregate level, because the concern there is not so much about privacy. The concern is not so much that you're learning my sensitive information, but the fact that you're using this data for a purpose other than the one for which I gave you that data. And those kinds of concerns have often come up, and Facebook, for example, has found themselves on the wrong end of that many, many times. When they use aggregate level data from their users, again, not from specific individuals, but just using analytics to overall figure out based on Facebook posts, what polling or voting trends are looking like, and when they have collaborated with political pollsters in order to do that kind of prediction, Facebook users have completely gone ballistic about that, and there was a huge outcry. And the worry so much was not so much that users were worried that their specific political leaning was being shared with outsiders, but more that data that they shared in one context for interacting with their family and friends or whatever was repurposed for a completely different purpose, which is political prediction. And those things, we don't quite understand yet what the ethical boundaries are. Is it never permissible to use data across different contexts, or is there a set of rules with appropriate transparency and accountability? So I think those are kind of evolving dimensions of ethics, but it is a distinction to keep in mind.
So one example I've seen of best practice is if you survey employees about their well-being, their satisfaction with the management, their satisfaction with their jobs, most companies that do this correctly, say if there are fewer than, say, 5 employees, they won't report it to the boss. The manager gets only aggregate data. If there are 3 employees working for a manager, she doesn't get to see the aggregate unless she has at least 5 reports. It'd be a typical number used by companies like, say, Gallup and these sort of structures. And so that's a way of at least having an organized policy for this piece. We want to know how well the managers are doing. We want feedback to them. We want to tell them, here's how happy people are or aren't. But we don't want to say, your employee Arvind is having a bad day today. Why don't you go check on him? And that's generally viewed as poor practice in my experience in industry. Are there other examples that you know of? You gave a bunch of abstract pieces in the one Facebook one. Are there more concrete examples of where one might worry about these things or good practice?
Yeah, so there was a really interesting medical study conducted by medical researchers in collaboration with Microsoft, where they looked at, again, this is not an employer-employee context, but this is a website user context, but nonetheless, apparently just based on how people move their mouse and how people type into their browsers, the Bing website has JavaScript that is monitoring people's typing and mouse movements, and can use analytics on that data to figure out if somebody is at risk for Parkinson's. And that is actually a more accurate test than standard medical diagnoses in many cases. And this is a fantastic finding from an early diagnosis perspective. And you can imagine various other types of analysis of people's typing patterns, language use, et cetera, on social media or in the workplace context that can be early predictors of mental health and also physical health issues. But again, the ethical question is, interaction that happened in one context, you're repurposing for a totally different context.
And perhaps ethics the other side, if you identify someone who's at risk or getting Parkinson's among your employees, are you ethically required to let them know?
Right.
So I do a lot of monitoring of people's social media with their consent. And one of the questions my institutional review board always asked is, if you detect suicidal ideation, what are you going to do about it? If you're looking at something, there is arguably an ethical, and you find something that someone is in fact considering killing themselves, then arguably you have an ethical requirement to take some sort of intervention. So I think it is tricky as you get more and more data.
Yeah.
Often we say, okay, we won't look at it except only 6 months after the fact because we're not set up to actually intervene and do something. So it's a weird sort of don't even want to know because if I knew now I would have to check and do something about it.
Yeah.
But it's a weird piece where we talk about what we shouldn't do.
Yeah.
But we also need to remember there are things you should be doing. And given that humans have so many biases in the HR process and other things, I could see a day when it would be unethical not to run an analytic to check to see what sort of discrimination is happening. Right? So I haven't seen any lawsuits of that form of why did you not use technology? Why did you just trust one guy's opinion on this when you could have actually analytically checked to see whether you were being fair or not? But I could see that sort of shifting.
I think that for things that really significantly affect people's well-being, like knowing whether or not the company thinks that they're going to commit suicide or something like that, it is really important that they have consented to that kind of analysis. I mean, things that deal with sensitivities like diseases and those kinds of things. Like ideally, in any time someone's being monitored, they're aware of the kinds of things they're being monitored for minimally. And have consented to it, but especially in the case where it's potentially sensitive, can potentially be used for discrimination, for letting someone off the job earlier, that kind of thing. Like, it's really important to get the consent.
I think that's an excellent point. In many of these cases, companies have the legal right to read all of your internal communications, all your texts.
Right, but
And
legal doesn't mean it's the right thing to, yeah.
Doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, and you could ask, is it ethical or not? For me, it's even more pragmatic, which is this something that will feel offensive, intrusive?
Yeah.
And I think one mistake that I've seen companies make is what may feel a violation of my privacy to me may not be what feels like a violation of your privacy to you.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think one thing that companies are often not quite as aware as they could have is different subgroups, different countries, different populations. How does it feel to have somebody reading your email and looking at it, quite apart from who gets to see it afterwards?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think that with this like sort of boom in technology and use of technology, there's a sort of giddiness to use it, and it ends up sort of blinding you to the human cost and the effect on humans. And so there's always going to be, or maybe not always, but there's currently a lot of push to use technology and modern machine learning, and this is what everyone is doing, and this is what you should be doing. But it's missing the human cost, and so it's really
We always ask, how creepy is it?
Yeah, exactly.
How is it going to feel? Are people going to get weirded out?
Right.
And they get weirded out by a lot of stuff.
And it's not, are you going to be weirded out?
No, that's irrelevant.
It's like the people who are actually going to be affected by it.
I think it's a different form of ethics question.
Right.
I'm not sure where it falls in your hierarchy, but for me it's much more a question of, is this something that people would be weirded by? If it might be, let's get informed consent, which does not mean I agree to let my company use any emails I ever read, but much more specific.
Right, that's sort of a virtue ethics approach.
Okay.
I want to be transparent for the sake of transparency, for the sake of well-being. That's sort of virtue,
Since you brought up creepiness, one of the
I like where this is going.
it's a great topic. I mean,
It's important.
Yeah, the reason that word I think so often comes up is because we have some intuition that certain analytics practices are, over the line, but we don't know quite how to define it. And I think what's exciting is that some academics have been doing work on trying to define that line and have come up with a definition of creepy, and I think that can be very practical and useful. I don't have a complete definition to share with you now, but I think a couple of things that have come out of scholars who have studied this, a couple of factors that go into what makes people consider something creepy. Often it feels arbitrary when there's an outcry about something being creepy, but it turns out it's really very predictable. One is, as we've been talking about a little bit, use of data in a context outside the one in which it was intended. And another factor that goes into creepiness is the prediction that you just did, could it conceivably have been done by a person, except with a lot more effort and careful thinking, versus is that only a prediction that could have been done using automated big data analytics methods? And I think a good example of this is one of the textbook examples of creepy analytics, which is the headline you might remember from a few years ago, how Target figured out that a teenage girl was pregnant before her father did. Right? And I think one aspect that contributed to the creepiness here is that we can't really imagine a retailer having a human process where there's somebody following someone around, looking at what they shop and making an inference about whether that means they are pregnant or not. So there's a fundamentally different type of inference you're able to make when you change the analytics from a traditional human-driven way to something where you automatically discover the patterns in the data. And so I think when we're crossing that kind of line, we need to be extra careful about whether this is either actually unethical or perceived as unethical, and where the line is.
That's a great point.
Cool. Shifting topics a little bit, diversity and inclusion efforts usually focus on trying to provide benefits to underrepresented groups. And what do you do if the data shows that the underrepresented employees are actually better compensated, better treatment, that there's a reverse discrimination?
Yeah, so this is a thing that happens, and one of the issues is that the data that's modeled is not reflective of everything that occurs in the workplace, and oftentimes managers are in a better position of determining, given this specific individual in this specific workplace with these other people they're interacting with, it's even more remarkable that they've reached this level of performance than someone else reaching the same level of performance but without any barriers or obstacles. So for example, I was working with a woman who was being bullied, but she was still able to get a first authored paper out at a sort of top conference. And I contacted her supervisor about it, and I said, I want you to understand this isn't just she has a first authored paper at this top tier conference. She did it while being bullied by someone in this field. So it was a psychologically traumatic thing to do, and she still did it. And so if you're just looking at the sort of output data, it's easy to think, oh, you know, this group, the women or whatever, are performing just as well, and they're, you know, maybe they're being overpaid or something like that. But the data does not reflect a lot of the underlying factors that ideally someone working closely with the individuals would have a much better understanding of. And so I'd be very wary of like blanket numbers that say minority subgroups are being underpaid or something like that, because there's a lot that's not modeled. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Couldn't agree more. One thing I'll also say is I think it's unlikely that just looking at two numbers and comparing them is going to give you the full picture of what's going on, pretty much along the lines of what you said. It can give us a hint that there is something here that we need to worry about. But what we then need to do is go deeper and understand what are the causal mechanisms that are producing this inequality. Sometimes that might be discrimination, but often it's not. Often it's something structural in an organization that is allowing one group to reach their potential better than another group. And so I think the data is only going to be a first hint, a first clue toward identifying those deeper structural factors. And it's almost never going to be the case that you can decide what the right intervention is just based on the data.
I've seen a bunch of cases where they're just put more concrete detail where the group that's underrepresented differs in some important way, so that the women who are hired tend to be more physicists and mathematicians and less computer scientists in their training. So you say, oh, it's different. It's this. We're comparing men versus women, but there are lots of other differences in terms of skill level, background level, or different task assignments. So lots of times there's something else varying. I think that comes back to this theme that the tendency is, oh, we'll go straight algorithmic. We will compute the numbers. Here's the men, here's the women, or here's the men, here's the women, whichever way it is. And we're ignoring this question of, are these apples to apples comparisons? Are they being treated the same way? Are they from the same recruiting pool? Do they have the same background? It's really easy to forget about the things that matter and just look at the numbers, much as I'm a numbers guy.
Yeah, it's definitely true.
So another question that came up, which I think is really interesting, is often one looks at, say you're trying to decide to interview some potential person you're going to hire, you're trying to look at her sales lead. Is it ethical to look at the race and gender of the person you're trying to hire or trying to sell to? And when I say, okay, who am I going to send from my team? Great, that's a woman. I'm going to send a woman to talk to her. Ethical, unethical, good idea, bad idea?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, the answer to whether or not something is ethical or not ethical is not straightforward. It's which flavor of ethics are you interested in? What are your values?
Yeah, nice.
But I will say that there is a procedure that sort of humans go through of establishing common ground in order to relate to one another. And when people have a common ground just coming into an interaction, they have what might be called in-group favoritism or in-group bias, which is a preference for the sort of ideas of the person that they see as in their in-group. A deeper understanding of the nuances of that person, more forgiveness, more empathy. Whereas if someone's interacting with someone who's perceived to be more as a stranger, doesn't have shared common ground, not the kind of person they interact with every day, there's the effect of out-group homogeneity bias, where you tend to see people as more alike, you tend to be less forgiving of errors, and you tend to just not really connect. And so for both individuals on both sides, I think it's a better experience to not put them in out-group homogeneity bias situations, to think about what the factors at play are and what's relevant there. It's going to be different depending, I guess, on like what's being sold or things like that, or if we're talking about interviewing versus sales. There's something that's when it comes to sales and trying to sort of persuade people, I guess it's, there's also this sort of thought about if it's like sneaky to use that as a persuasion technique or something.
Well, we certainly match people for recruiting. We send coming for our
Exactly.
company to their place they're alumni from.
Yeah.
If we're trying to sell someone, we try and find, oh, you're another golfer, or you come back from the same.
Yeah.
So people do try and make these connections on things that are
Right.
clearly not protected categories.
Right, yeah. I mean, it does get a little bit trickier with protected categories, but at the same time, like, if you don't see color, you don't see discrimination. You can't just sort of pretend that it doesn't exist because it's a protected category. So yeah, it's important to weigh that, like, with what you're selling and what you're trying to do. Is it going to be better for both of the individuals if we sort of think about these things and just sort of make the decision from there?
Yeah, that's great. I definitely support the idea of trying to find common ground. Just maybe one little, small caveat that I would add to that is often when we put into place this kind of, matching, if you will, between people at our organization and the people whom we're trying to recruit, and we have diversity efforts in place, what that unintentionally ends up doing is putting more of a burden on the women and minority employees in the organization to do more of that work. So I think that's something we should be super careful about.
Yeah, in a male-dominated field, our women spend all their time going on hiring and other meetings, which is an undue burden, which then may not be reflected in the salary, compensation, other pieces when they're doing extra work, which doesn't show up.
Exactly.
So there's already an implicit, well-intentioned bias.
Yeah.
We want these women to help make us recruit more women, but we are making them do extra work, which we don't pay them extra money for. I can't say that word, not being recorded right now.
And not just in a sales context, even for organizing a conference like this. Conference organizers these days are very aware of the importance of diversity, and that's obviously great. But one thing that ends up happening is women in the field are often inundated with requests. And it's emotional labor to turn down a lot of those requests. And when I'm a conference organizer, I think about that and I don't have a great solution, but it's just something to carefully weigh in every situation.
Just get Meg to go to more conferences and give up her day job.
You pay me for it, so.
Yeah, good idea. Cool, so we're back to the last few minutes. I'm wondering if either of you have any last thoughts or takeaways that you would like people to remember as they go about trying to worry about ethics in their organizations?
So I was really excited to hear about this conference and sort of look into the technology you guys are thinking about. I think one thing that's a relatively unexplored area is using these kinds of frameworks to sort of ferret out human biases. So I'd love to see more of that in things like performance reviews, things that are very human-driven, using people analytics kind of technology to figure out, are these humans acting in consistent, biased, or stereotyped ways? For example, do I tend to see communication difficulties written in female performance reviews more than male performance reviews? And actually leveraging the tools to help with human biases. That's less of the concern of what biases the models have and more, how can we use these models to deal with the human biases?
Now, they're great examples of looking at reviews where reviews of women have really different terms in many companies than reviews of men, even when the women seem to be doing the same thing at the same level of competence. And just the sheer language, just counting the words, you go, whoa, that's a little frightening.
Yeah, I also want to say it's also very important to look at intersectionality. I want to get that out really quick. We haven't mentioned that yet, but when we're talking about subgroups, like it's not enough to look at if you identify as black or white, male or female. Like the experience of a black woman is very different than the experience of a white male, and it's important to look at those subcategorizations. Sorry.
I would say also
just want to get that out.
Also across job functionality.
So
women in tech and women in sales are facing really different, at least the organizations I deal with are very different subgroups.
You have to look at these combinations of things to really understand.
Yeah, thank you for sharing this idea of ferreting out human bias. And I want to give you one example of just how powerful some of these analytics and statistical techniques can be to really go after things that we couldn't have imagined without these powerful techniques. And this is an example that comes from a paper written by economists at LSU about the behavior of certain judges. They theorized that if a judge looking at a judge and where they went to college many, many years ago, and the college football team of that college. If that team had lost a big game in the last day or two, then statistically speaking, the defendants that the judge is ruling about are going to have worse outcomes. That was their hypothesis. Can you imagine, trying to figure this out without big data and without proper statistical techniques? But they were able to test it because they have data available on tens of thousands of court cases, and they showed that that is exactly the case for judges who went to LSU, regardless of how long ago that was. And that's, a crazy paper, and just it reminds us how many of these implicit biases we might have that we might not know about at all for ourselves unless we have data sets that can be used to point them out.
Good. I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you both for wonderful things, and thank you guys for the questions.
Thank you.